The thing I want to talk about today, my YouTube channel just got mentioned, and I think I've got like 18 things up there at the moment. So this will be edited shortly afterwards, hopefully. I want to talk about challenging the six-step story. Now, if you've looked at my book, you already know that the first chapter is called Challenging the Creation Myths. And I do that based primarily on original documents that I found in the various archives around the East Coast from the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, the most challenging chapter of all the chapters in the book, there's 30 chapters in the book I had to write for the book, was this chapter 23 on writing the 12 steps. Writing the 12 steps. Could there be a more important story in AA history than the one that explains the source of the 12 steps and how they came to be written? I mean, what's AA if it's not the 12 steps? So it should have been easy. I mean, after all, Bill told that wonderful, wonderful story about how he wrote the 12 steps, and he told the story over and over again. But I got to tell you, it just really, really wasn't easy. It took me more than 6 months just to unravel all the contradictions and problems in that lovely story that Bill told over and over and over again. Now, I've shown repeatedly in my book and explained in many of these presentations that Bill Wilson was just not an accurate historian, which is a good thing and a bad thing. You know, Bill was a great storyteller, and those stories were all too frequently parables or mythical versions of what really happened, as opposed to what really happened. Now, we never get to exactly what really happened. No historian ever gets to exactly whatever really happened. But that's the goal of all the research I've done and all the writing I've done and all the talks I've given in the last 6 years have been to see if we can just get a little bit closer to what really happened. Now, Bill wasn't even trying to be historically accurate in his stories. All Bill Wilson was concerned on was getting people sober. The details of the stories just were not important. They were inconsequential. What was important was the impact the story and the message of the story might have on the suffering alcoholic. That's what Bill's stories were about. So you can hardly fault him for if the historical record contradicts him as frequently as it does, and believe me, it's pretty frequently. But Bill's historical inaccuracy has been widely noted. I mean, I'm not the only guy saying this, and acknowledged by all scholarly historians, and even Pass It On, which is a conference-approved book that people so frequently, draw our attention to. According to Pass It On, Bill was, quote, never reluctant to stretch a fact for the sake of emphasis. And he often, quote, spoke in metaphor rather than relating events as they actually happened. And he was, quote, never likely to pass up the opportunity to deliver a parable when he thought it could do some good. When he thought it could do some good, we get parables. And there's one other element that turns up regularly in many of Bill's problematic stories. Well aware of his own ego problems, Bill constantly told stories that took the spotlight off himself and gave credit to others for things that he was solely responsible for. And just for instance, just think about all those people that Bill Wilson christened as co-founders throughout his life. But both of these tendencies, this eliminating the messy details of what maybe really happened to sharpen and clarify the message, and let's take the focus off of me, play a very large part in the story Bill told throughout the last 21 years of his life about how he came to write the 12 steps. Now, Lois Wilson said that Bill wrote the 12 steps during the first week of December 1938. And that date fits really well with all the other contemporary evidence we have for when each of the other chapters of the Big Book were actually written. This means the steps weren't written until just 4 months. 4 months before the Big Book was published on April 10th, 1939. And thus chapter 5 and 6, How It Works and Into Action, were the last two chapters written, because obviously you can't write 5 and 6 until you've already got the steps in place. In Bill Wilson's version of the story, he said that he had realized that what he'd already written was just much too loose, much, it wasn't specific enough. So loose, he thought, that the drunks, he said, this was a quote he kept using all the time, that they could just wiggle right out of it. What we needed was some specific stuff. And that was certainly true. Before the 12 steps were written, the instructions, the so-called instructions on how to get sober, were only very loosely described in there is a solution, more about alcoholism, we agnostics, and working with others. Now, it seems to me that those chapters hit the basics of Alcoholics Anonymous, namely that if you're a real alcoholic, you have no defense against the first drink, which he talks about in There Is a Solution and expands on in more about alcoholism, that you can get yourself you don't have any mental defense against the first drink, but you can get yourself a spiritual defense against the first drink, which he talks about in There Is a Solution and We Agnostics. And then when those two things aren't working for you and you're still pacing the floor of the Mayflower Hotel in Akron, Ohio, and you're 5 months sober and you understand all this and you had a white light experience, but you're thinking about going in the bar, what do? When all else fails, work with another alcoholic. And that's basically the instructions that Wilson had come up with prior to writing the 12 steps. And indeed, plenty of room for those sleeky alcoholics to just wiggle out of it. That's not very specific. Obviously, something far more solid, specific, and concrete was needed. So Bill claims that this really worried him so much that it brought on one of his imaginary ulcers. It seems that Bill Wilson's stress levels always exhibited themselves in his stomach. This was not the first time this had happened. Lois mentions them with some regularity in her diary. So with this imaginary ulcer, Bill goes upstairs and he lays down on the bed and he picked up a yellow pad of paper and he said that he started with those original 6 steps. And I just broke them down into more specific actions. And when I counted them all up, wow, there was 12 of them. 12 steps. We ended up with the new 12 steps out of those old 6 steps. Note that this is where the famous 6-step story we're going to be talking about today first enters the picture, a story that Bill told repeatedly during the last 21 years of his life. So what's my problem here, right? I'm going to write this chapter on writing the big book. Why don't I just recount Bill's story and move on? Let's get it on. Well, actually, there were three major problems, and all of them are related to this very, very, very problematic 6-step story Bill Wilson was leaning so heavily on as the origin and source of the 12 steps. First big problem, the 6 steps that Bill mentioned didn't just break down into the 12 steps. And we're going to see that. Second, I could find absolutely no evidence in the 1935 to 1939 correspondence and documentation that was saved that there was ever anything even remotely like an original laid out 6-step program of recovery. And third, if the 12 steps didn't come from the 6 steps, where did it come from? That's a burning question. So first of all, I needed to explore Wilson's claim that the 12 steps were just a result of him just breaking down those original 6 steps. And this was interesting on a couple of different levels. We're going to come at this from 2 different directions. First of all, there was a few things in Bill's original 6 steps that they don't appear in the original 12 steps. And when I say the original 12 steps, I'm talking about the very first publication of them. The pre-publication multilith copy came out like on February 20th, 1939. The big book, after some corrections were made to it based on the multilith copy, came out on April 10th, 1939. So the original 12 steps were actually printed in the multilith copy in mid-February of 1939. So here they are. Now what I've done is I've underlined the stuff that in my opinion just doesn't, they showed up in the 6 steps that Bill talked about, but they didn't show up in the 12 steps. There was, for instance, no we. The most important word to a lot of people in the 12 steps is the very first one. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, but there was no we in the original printing of the 12 steps in the multilith, and he admitted we were licked. So the underlined highlighted stuff is stuff that I don't see in the 12 steps, and the rest of the phrases, yeah, sure, that shows up there. We, and he talked about our defects or our sins. Sins, really? Really, that's bad terminology for a lot of people, and that got dropped. We confessed or shared, and we did this in confidence, according to him. We made restitution all the people we had harmed by our drinking. Weed shows up all over the place. We're going to work with other alcoholics, but with no thought of reward in money or prestige. No mention of that in the 12 steps. And again, the we shows up in number 6, and they're praying to God for the power to practice these precepts. But even more interesting and important to me, and at least in my estimation, is the fact that there's an amazing number of things in the original version of the 12 steps, again, that multilith, pre-publication multilith copy, that you're not going to find anywhere. Not going to find anywhere in Bill's supposed 6 steps. That means if he's taking the 6 steps and breaking them down, you would imagine there would be source material left and right for everything that shows up in the 12 steps. This is not even close to the case. So I've underlined here the things that do correspond to the 6 steps, and I've highlighted the things that don't correspond to the 6 steps. And here's our first step, is that our lives have become unmanageable. Not mentioned in the 6th step. Oh, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity? Not mentioned in the 6 steps. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God, the direction of God? Not mentioned. Searching and fearless is making no appearance in those 6 steps. And by the way, in the 6 steps, you just admit to another human being. But now we got God and ourselves and the exact nature of our wrongs going on there. Step 6, no appearance. Step 7, no appearance. Step 8, hardly an appearance. And 9 is also exactly the same way. 10, no mention whatsoever of that in the 6 steps. And all of a sudden, we're adding in meditation, conscious contact with God, knowledge of his will for us, and in 12, having had a spiritual experience as a result of this course of action. So there's like 3 parts of the 12 step, and the middle one gets mentioned in the 6 steps, but the other 2 are kind of drive-by things. Clearly, those original 12 steps offer instructions that go far beyond and are tremendously more specific than anything found in Bill Wilson's 6-step program. There's an awful lot of new things that have been added here, folks. So I just naturally had to ask, where did all that new material come from if it's not in the 6 steps? I mean, this is what he's telling you. Yeah, I took the 6 steps and I ended up with the 12 steps, you know. But look at all that yellow highlighted stuff is brand new compared to the 6 steps. So, I mean, it's an excellent question. Where did all that new material come from? And we're going to hear much more about that later in this presentation. So the second problem, that was the first problem. No, the 6 steps didn't break down to the 12 steps on any way, shape, form, or manner. The second problem was that once I started looking for verified sources of that story of there originally being a 6-step program in Alcoholics Anonymous, there was no evidence to be found in any of the contemporary documents of there being a 6-step program prior to the creation of the 12 steps. In fact, I find this absolutely shocking. In fact, the first record I can find of Bill Wilson even telling that 6-step story, the first time he told that story that I can find was May 23rd, 1949. That's a full 10 years. A full 10 years have passed since he wrote the steps, and it's the first time he's telling the 6-step story. And for the past 15 years, I've been asking all kinds of AA researchers and historians for an earlier source for that 6-step story. And if there's one out there, no one's found it yet. And if they find one, I would love to hear about it because again, our job is to get closer to what really happened. Well, it seems to me that what really happened is 10 years after the 12 steps were actually written by Bill Wilson, he made up this story and rolled it out at a convention of psychiatrists in Montreal, Canada on May 23rd, 1949. Worse yet, the first time he told the version of the story in May of 1949, Bill said, this is what he told the psychiatrist. He said, Ebby had offered him that whole 6-step program that when he showed up for that initial kitchen table meeting in late November of 1934. Ebby just handed it to him on a silver platter. That was the 6 steps, and that's what we've been working for since even before I got sober. But in all of his later talks and writings, Bill told a much different story. He always claimed in those later stories, after this one original faux pas of it all coming from Ebby, he claims that those original 6 steps had, quote unquote, gradually evolved within the fellowship during its early years. Now, again, all of the primary documents from A's earliest years, there is absolutely no evidence supporting Bill's claim of what he called a pretty consistent procedure. That was his 6-step program, pretty consistent procedure, before the 12 steps were written. December 1938, shortly before the book came out. Now, it's a historian's rule, Absence of evidence, just because I can't find any evidence for it, is not evidence of absence, right? However, in this case, there's such a huge amount of negative evidence that it positively destroys any possibility of Bill's six-step story even being remotely true. If there had been a pretty consistent procedure of a six-step program around as early as 1934, or if such a six-step program had evolved over time as more and more people got sober, then you could reasonably expect to find mention of those six steps in the primary documents and the writings published in 1938 and 1939 as we lead up to the publication of Alcoholics Anonymous on April 10th, 1939. Now, people, there's a ton of documents. There is just a ton of documents. And we're going to run through some of these and we're going to look at them for evidence of those six steps. February 1938, Frank Amos writes a report on how AA is working in Akron. He goes out to Akron, he comes back and he writes a report for John D. Rockefeller Jr. May 1938, Fitz Mayo, Bill's second guy he got sober when he got back to New York in 1935. He writes the first version of his story, and in June of 1938, Bill writes the first version of There Is a Solution. There is a solution. There's a solution. Well, in June of 1938, just as Bill's writing that down, Hank Parkhurst writes down his ideas of what should and shouldn't be in the book. And then also in June of 1938, Hank creates an outline for the book. And in November of 1938, Hank writes his proposed Q&A chapter for the book, which was not ever printed. 1938 to 1939, this is the sweet spot here for information on where we're going to find the six steps. Many letters are written by AA people, and most decisively, as a source of the lack of information or credit to the six-step theory, there are 30 personal stories that appear in the back of the first edition of the Big Book, all of which were written between October 1938 and March of 1939. And as you're going to see, none of which have any mention of Bill Wilson's six-step program. Not a bit. Not a bit. I mean, these are the people who are supposed to be telling us how they got sober and what a great thing it is. 30 different stories. To begin with, Bill regularly changed the wording of the alleged six steps. I mean, he messed with it all the time. It was a general procedure kind of thing. But here, once again, are the version of them. This is the six steps that he mentioned when he offered them in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age, which he wrote in 1957. So, number one, we admitted that we were licked, that we were powerless over alcohol. Number two, we made a moral inventory of our defects or sins. Three, we confessed or shared our shortcomings with another person in confidence. Four, we made restitution to all those we had harmed by our drinking. Number five, we tried to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward in money or prestige. And six, we prayed to whatever God we thought there was for power to practice these precepts. So, let's look at some of these contemporary documents and see how often they mention anything that even vaguely remembers those six steps. In February 1938, we're going to review some of these things I had mentioned earlier. Frank Amos goes to Akron to see what the Ohio people are doing to actually stay sober, and he's going to report back to John D. Rockefeller Jr., which he does. And in his report, he describes there are 7 things, according to Frank Amos, 7 things that they're doing to stay sober in Ohio in February 1938. According to Frank Amos, the new man must, a lot of musts here, must realize he can never drink again, must surrender absolutely to God, must remove all sins from his life, must have daily quiet time, the Oxford group name for meditation, must help other alcoholics, important but not vital to meet with alcoholics, so much for meetings, and important but not vital to go to church. So, how many of those line up with Bill's 6 steps? Maybe 2. Must realize that he can never drink again lines up with Bill's number 1. We admitted that we were licked, that we were powerless over alcohol. But must surrender absolutely to God and must remove all sins from his life and must have daily quiet time, making no appearance in the 6 steps that Bill offered in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age. And must help other alcoholics does in fact correspond, this would be the second correspondence, to Bill's number 5. We tried to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward or money or prestige. But no mention in the 6 steps of the importance or unimportance of meeting with alcoholics and the importance of, but not vital, of going to church. So clearly, they were not working anything like Bill's six-step program in Akron in February 1938. Clearly. Late May 1938, at the same time as Bill's writing his story, Bill's story of late May of 1938, Fitz Mayo, number 3 guy in New York, was also writing the first version of his personal story that was going to go in the back of the book. But the path of recovery that Fitz describes is radically different from Bill's 6 steps. Fitz Mayo's story, Our Southern Friend, appears in all 4 editions of the Big Book, and the only 2 other people who have their story in all 4 editions of the Big Book to date are Dr. Bob and Archie Trowbridge. So this puts him in a pretty elite company here, Fitz Mayo. Fitz called the original version of his story Me and John, and in those days everybody would know that John meant John Barleycorn. In late May, Bill's writing his story, Fitz is writing his story. This is what the original type version, this is right out of the original type version of his story. He's in Towns Hospital. He says, one evening I was playing bridge in my room with 2 other alcoholics and a drug addict. I had to note the drug addict, you'll see in a second why. Anything to keep from thinking of the blank future. When the game was over, the men left the room, but one returned. He looked at me and said, you think you're hopeless, don't you? Certainly, I replied, I know it. Well, you're not, he said. There are men on the streets of New York today who are worse than you, and they don't drink anymore. Then the man asked me, would you be willing to try to live on a new basis, to try to live up to ideals by trying to be absolutely honest, absolutely pure, absolutely unselfish, and absolutely loving in all your relationships with your fellow men to get rid of this drink problem? Of course I would, Fitz says. I declared without much thought. I'd do anything. Then all your troubles are over, said the man, and he left the room. Folks, those recommended 4 absolutes are pure Oxford group teaching, pure, unadulterated, central core teaching of the Oxford group. And that's exactly what Fitz and all the other members of early AA were doing to stay sober in late 1935 and 36 and 37. Many years to come after that. We always have to remember that AA grew out of the Oxford group. There's just no denying it is just the soil out of which Alcoholics Anonymous grew. And while neither of the alleged 6 steps nor the 12 steps are directly traceable back to the Oxford group, the influence of their general spiritual practices can be seen repeatedly throughout AA's suggested program of recovery. No denying that. We don't want to deny that. In those days, in the late 30s, they were trying to distance themselves from the Oxford group from a whole bunch of different reasons. But it's a long time has gone by, and we can start really looking back at this and acknowledging how much we do in fact owe to the Oxford group. But the 12 steps nor the 6 steps are directly traceable back to the OG. It was, after all, exactly these Oxford group general principles in one form or another. There was a lot of take it or leave it stuff going on here, folks. In one form or another, that AA's early members were working in the hopes of getting sober and then staying that way. So, in short, it was an Oxford group program of recovery that they were following before we had a 12-step program, and we did not have a 6-step program. Now, here we have the multilith version. This is mid-February 1939. The multilith comes out, and it's 8 months after Fitz wrote that original version, and it's 2 months after his best friend Bill Wilson has written the 12 steps. So here's the new version of Fitz's story 8 months after the first one. He says 4 alcoholics play bridge in a smoke-filled room. We got rid of the drug guy. You know, we don't want a drug addict in there anymore. They're all alcoholics. I just love that. 4 alcoholics play bridge in a smoke-filled room. The game is over, and the other 3 leave. One man comes back, closing the door behind him. He looks at me. You think you're homeless, don't you? He says. I know it, I reply. Well, you're not, says the man. There are men on the streets of New York today who are worse than you, and they don't drink anymore. Then he asked me if I believe in a power greater than myself. Whoa. AA familiar, whether I call that power God, Allah, Confucius, prime cause, divine mind, or any other name. Then he asked me if I'm willing to right all the wrongs I've ever done to anyone, no matter how wrong I thought they were. Am I willing to be honest with myself about myself and tell someone about myself? And am I willing to think of other people instead of myself and of their needs to get rid of this drink problem? I'll do anything, I reply. Then all your troubles are over, said the man, and he leaves the room. So Fitz's original story from May of 1930 told the truth about recovery in early AA, that it was really all about the Oxford group. And on the very early days, it was all about the Oxford group. But by the time his story appears in the Multilith, 2 months after the 12 steps have been written, the Oxford group stuff has been eliminated, wiped out. We're not doing any more four absolutes at all. That's a red flag that this is an Oxford group deal. And the actions from the 12 steps have been put and substituted in its place. This is an absolutely perfect example of what we will see in a few minutes in Earl Treat's later big book story. We, human beings, not just drug alcoholics and alcoholics, we regularly change the story we tell so that it better reflects the present reality. We regularly change the stories we tell so that it better reflects the present reality, rather than accurately telling about what really happened. The professional term for this is called false memory. Man, in early June of 1938, the month after he writes his Bill's story, Bill writes, "There is a solution." And that chapter presents his brilliant genius diagnosis of the real alcoholic's problem. You have no mental defense against the first drink, and his promised solution. You need to get yourself a vital spiritual experience. So this is a chapter that's got, there is a solution. Let's look at the title here. There is a solution. Okay, oh, good, Bill. What's the solution? Is there any mention or even allusion to a 6-step program in Bill's chapter proclaiming to be his solution to alcoholism, written in early June of 1938? Not a single word. Also in the first week of June 1938, Hank Parkhurst, Bill Wilson's right-hand man, they're like joined at the hip here, folks. He wrote an 11-page document arguing that his ideas, he had a whole bunch of argumentative ideas about what should and should not go into the chapter. There is a solution that Bill was just then writing. Did Hank make any complaints in those 11 pages of his ideas that Bill had somehow forgotten to mention the 6-step solution in that chapter called There Is a Solution? Not a word. And then in the third week of June 1938, 2 weeks later, Hank Parkhurst wrote a detailed outline for the different chapters that are going to be written for the big book. And really, this is an amazingly prophetic and accurate document. 22 out of the 25 bang show up right in the big book. But did any of those 25 proposed chapters make any mention or even allusion to a 6-step program? Sorry. No 6 steps or anything resembling them to be found there. In November 1938, Parkhurst also wrote a proposed chapter for the big book. God, it's just a beautiful thing, which of course it never appeared in the book. And in the archived typescript that I found down in the General Service Office in New York City is 15 pages long. And it presents one man's account of how the program of recovery was then working from his perspective in New York City. Is there any mention or even allusion to a 6-step program to be found anywhere in those 15 pages? Not a word. Not. How about in any of the contemporary letters in which they explain to outsiders what they were doing to get and then stay sober? Here's one example. July 22nd, 1938. This is a month after Bill's done all those writing of those first 2 chapters almost. And he writes to Dr. Esther Richardson, who's down in Johns Hopkins University. He had visited with her, and now they're doing some letters back and forth. And this is how he explains what they're doing. He says, out of old and well-known elements, they found that we might compound a synthesis which would possess new and rather startling powers in this field. Well, that sounds good, but it doesn't really tell me what we're talking about. Each of us has felt it imperative to place our kit of tools, whatever that may be, there's no specifics here, before other sufferers. In the first year of recovery, we have discovered that it is almost mandatory for us to do this. We have to turn our interest outward towards others, lest we be overwhelmed by our own conflicts and difficulties, which would rise out of the past to tear us down. Now, certainly there's a promise of something new and different here, folks, but really little more than some general spiritual principles, along with a heavy emphasis on moral psychology. Moral psychology is another whole long presentation we do. It's really about stop being so self-centered and pay attention to other people. Moral psychology, which was Dr. Silkworth's and Hank Parker's solution for alcoholism. But still no mention of those 6 steps. February 11th, I love this letter. I found this letter. February 11th, 1939, Hank Parker writes to Jackie Williams. Now, Jackie Williams is down in Washington, D.C., and he's slipping and sliding all over the place. But he's somebody that he and Jim Burwell know well. So this is Parkhurst to Jackie Williams. He said, when I started out on this thing, Bill Wilson, so he started out in September of 1935. He was the first guy that Bill Wilson got sober when he came back from Ohio. When I started out on this thing, Bill Wilson for months kept my nose on one thing. Hank, where have you been selfish? Moral psychology. Where have you hurt people? Moral psychology. Where have you been wrong? I don't care how wrong the other person may have been, but where have you been wrong? Month after month, I went through this sort of thing, and only now, 1930, early 39, the light beginning to break upon me, only now I'm able to begin to tell myself the truth. And I wonder if that inward knowledge that Bill inspired, that actually I am selfish and terrifically selfish, only thinking of myself, has not produced a long period of sobriety. Moral psychology, that's what Hank was staying sober on, and that's what he was selling and pitching throughout this entire period. So once again, we got absolutely no mention of any 6 steps to sobriety, but frankly, we got plenty of talk about moral psychology in both Bill's letter and in Hank's letter. Finally, there's an absolute wealth of testimony about how people got sober in the late 1930s, and that can be found in the 30 stories that appear in the back of the first edition of the Big Book. Amazingly, none of those 30 stories mention anything like Bill's 6 steps as their path to sobriety, except story number 31, Bill's story, which, as we will see soon, is a completely different story. Now, look, I don't really purposely want to bore you here with this, dragging out this presentation, but most AAs have never read the stories in the back of the first edition of our book. So they're frequently skeptical when I say that there's no evidence of the 6-step program to be found there. So please bear with me as we review each of those stories, all 30 of them, looking for evidence of what our earliest members say they actually did. What did we actually do to get sober? What was the turning point? You know, what did we do to get sober and then stay sober? Dr. Bob, if you think you're an atheist, an agnostic, a skeptic, and have any other form of intellectual pride which keeps you from accepting what's in this book, I feel sorry for you. Your Heavenly Father will never let you down. The European drinker, we've been trying man's ways and they always fail. He told me, you can't win unless you try God's way. That day I gave my will to God and asked to be directed. The traveler, editor, scholar, no conviction was necessary to establish my status as a miserable failure at managing my own life. I began to read the Bible daily and to go over a simple devotional exercise as a way to begin each day. Gradually, I began to understand. The backslider, all my life, he said, I've been doing things on my own human will as opposed to God's will, and that the only certain way for me to stop drinking was to submit my will to God and let him handle my difficulties. Home brewmeister, Clarence Snyder, spiritually, I have found a friend, capital F, a friend who never lets me down and is ever eager to help. I can actually take my problems to him, and he does give me comfort, peace, and radiant happiness. For all of these blessings, I thank him. The 7th month slip, I only know that as long as I seek God's help to the best of my ability, just so long will liquor never bother me. My wife and I, they were living proof, those guys that came to me, they were living proof that the sincere attempt to follow the cardinal teachings of Jesus Christ was keeping them sober. I acknowledged my faults to God and asked him his help to keep me on that course I had to follow. An award of the probate court, I learned the secret. They had a religious experience. I was willing and renewed my acquaintance with God and acknowledged him as a reality. I found it easy. I came to life and have been free now for 2 years. I hope never to take another drink. Ace is full. But But if friends and fellowship were to disappear tomorrow, I don't think I would be dismayed. Back of it all, there is the knowledge that I have a divine Father, that as long as I try to walk as he has laid down for me to do throughout my life, nothing of ill can befall me, that if I wish, I can be sober for the rest of my life. And the fearful one, and it was so simple. The sum and substance of it seemed to be that if I would turn to God, it was very probable that he could do a better job of my life than I had. The salesmen, they made it very plain. Those guys that visited me, they made it very plain that I had to seek God, that I had to state my case to him and ask for help. Every morning I read a part of the Bible, and I read a part of the Bible and ask God to carry me through the day safely. I've been sober for 2 years, kept that way by submitting my natural will to the higher power, and that is all there is to it. Truth freed me. Are you right with the Father who knows your needs before you ask? If so, your help comes from an ever-present and all-powerful Father. A close shave, I feel that the combined efforts of these 3 Christian gentlemen who approached me in the beginning made it possible for me to have a vital spiritual experience. And the alcoholic's wife, since giving my husband's problem to God, I have found peace and happiness. My husband and I now talk over our problems and trust in a divine power. We have now started to live. When we live with God, we want for nothing. And the Rolling Stone, A Religious Awakening, has conveyed to me through some unseen force, I have found a new life, and I know as long as I do the few things that God requires of me to do, I never will take another drink. And finally, there's this just lovely thing from the Car Smasher. Car Smasher, why not avail myself of this all-wise, ever-present help? This I did. I ask for, accept, and acknowledge this help, and know that so long as I do, I shall never take a drink. And what is more important, though impossible without the first, all other phases of my life have been helped. There is, he says, it seems to me, 4 steps to be taken by one who is a victim of alcoholism. First, have a real desire to quit. Second, admit you can't. This is hardest. Third, ask for his ever-present help. Fourth, accept and acknowledge this help. Doesn't correspond much to those 6 steps that they were doing, huh? And that's the sum total of the important testimony on how to get and stay sober to be found in 16 of the 18 Ohio stories written for the Big Book in 1938 and 1939. The 2 remaining Akron stories make no mention of God's role in their sobriety, which are so prominent in the other 16. Riding the Rods emphasizes fellowship as the critical factor in his recovery, while Fired again only notes that the alcoholics who visited him in the hospital, quote, imparted to me the necessary knowledge and mental tools which have resulted in my complete sobriety. In short, nothing even remotely close to Bill Wilson's 6 steps was thought worthy of mention in any of the recovery stories from Ohio that were written during the Flying Blind period, when the 6 steps were supposed to be so dominant. The New Yorkers also make no mention of the supposed 6-step program in their 12 Big Book stories. This is Hank's story. I love this one. He raised my hopes so high it looked as though he had something. I don't know. I guess I was so sold that I expected him to spring some kind of pill, and I asked him desperately what it was. And he said God. And I laughed. And then 6 pages later in this story, brr, this floor is cold on my knees. Why are these tears running down my cheeks? God, have mercy on my soul. A feminine victory, Florence Rankin. Are you willing to give up? Are you willing to say, here it is, God, all mixed up. I don't know how to unmix it. I'll leave it up to you. Our Southern friend, Fitz Mayo. The thing I do is to say, God, here I am, and here are all my troubles. I've made a mess of things and can't do anything about it. You take me and all my troubles and do anything you want with me. It never occurred to me that he, in his infinite wisdom, knew much better than I what I should have and be and do, and that if I simply turned the decision over him, I would be led along the right path. And then smile with me. From that day, I gave and still give and always will time every day to read the Word of God and let him do all the carrying. Who am I to try to run myself or anyone else? Educated agnostic. Your belief in the basic spirituality of life has grown and with it, a belief in a supreme and guiding power for good. The first step, another step mentioned here, the first step I took when I admitted to myself for the first time that all my previous thinking might be wrong. First step was acknowledging your thinking was wrong. The second step came when I first consciously wished to believe. Another prodigal son. Then the next day, a fine fellow came and in a halting but very effective way told me how he had placed himself in God's hands and keeping. Almost before I knew it, I was asking God to clean me up. On his way, I should not be surprised to find myself coming to the astounding conclusion that God, whoever or whatever he may be, is eminently more capable of running this universe than I am. At last, I believe I am on my way. And The Lone Endeavor, the story that was actually written by Ruth Hawk based on correspondence with The Lone Endeavor's Pat Cooper's mother and Pat Cooper. The Lone Endeavor. I knew that the only way to combat this curse was to ask the help of that greater power, God. God is my only chance. And finally, from the artist's conception, these men were thinking straight, had given themselves, their minds, over to a higher power for direction. The day I made my first efforts in this direction, an entire new world opened up for me. Drinking as a vicious habit was washed completely out of my consciousness. The two remaining New York stories make no mention of God, nor do they note any other factor that contributed to their sobriety. A Different Slant is less than 400 words long. It's the shortest story in the first edition. And Hindsight only mentions, quote, what I heard was hard to believe, but I wanted to believe it. What's more, I wanted to try it and see if it wouldn't work for me, whatever that is. It worked, and it's still working. So again, not one single report of anything even remotely resembling Bill's six-step program being practiced in New York during the blind period. Now, clearly, people were staying sober in late 1938, but how? I mean, although Dr. Bob Smith makes no mention of it in his Big Book story is almost all drunk-a-log, we do know that Bob made amends on his first day sober, and that he did the equivalent of a fifth step with Bill Wilson very, very shortly after that. But both of these are really just standard Oxford group practices. What those 30 Big Book stories do all seem to agree on are that there are three basic actions which must be taken if you truly want to stay sober. This is what I see when I look at those 30 stories, when I go back to all of those places where this is what happened, and I was drinking one day and the next day I wasn't. Admit you're licked, surrender your life to God, and be helpful and useful to others. Those three things are what jump out at me from those 30 stories as being the crux, the turning point of what's going on. And all of those three steps, if they were admitted to be three steps to recovery that are mentioned over and over and over again in those 30 steps, are perfectly agree with the message of recovery that Bill had detailed in the chapters he had written just before he wrote, already written for the Big Book, before he wrote the 12 steps. Admit you're licked. There is a solution in More About Alcoholism. Surrender your life to God. There is a solution in We Agnostics. Be useful and helpful to others. Working with others. It's exactly what Bill had already outlined, what these guys are reporting they were doing. And quite obviously, the key element of those three was the absolute necessity of surrendering your life to God. I can think of no better example of this than Clarence Schneider's story of his surrender to Jesus in February of 1938. Clarence did his surrender with Dr. Bob in the hospital. They both got down on their knees. Dr. Bob said, come on, get down on your knees here. He says, well, I don't know how to pray. He says, I'll show you how. They both got down on their knees, and Dr. Bob coached Clarence Schneider by saying, Jesus, this is Clarence Schneider. He's a drunk. Clarence, this is Jesus. Ask him to come into your life. Ask him to remove your drinking problem and pray that he manage your life because you are unable to manage it yourself. And then when Clarence came into his first meeting in Akron, he was handed a piece of paper by one of the men. And this is what it said. It said, therefore, if any be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. Straight out of 2 Corinthians. Clarence said he broke down crying. And this sort of explicit Christian religiosity was not just confined to Ohio. In February of 1937, just months before the the New York group broke from the Oxford group, Bill Rudell was released from Towns Hospital and advised to go contact Bill Wilson if he wanted to stay sober. And he and his wife, Kathleen, visited Bill and Lois in their home shortly after that, and they had some heartfelt discussion, and then Bill and Lois invited him upstairs, where, according to a letter that Bill Rudell wrote to Bill Wilson a few years later, he said, quote, Kathleen and I knelt down in front of the fireplace in your upstairs parlor with both you and Lois, and I made my surrender. Clearly, what was going on in early AA was very much along the lines of this simple three-step program. Admit your licks, surrender your life to God, be helpful and useful to others. Not the carefully crafted six-step program that Bill later claimed it to be. Whenever I make that claim, someone always objects, saying that I'm forgetting about page 263 in our big book, which explicitly claims there was a six-step program in Akron long before the 12 steps were written. In his big book story, He Sold Himself Short, Earl Treat says Dr. Bob took him through, quote, six-step program as it was at the time, end quote. And he supposedly did this in April of 1937 with Dr. Bob in 3 or 4 hours. Went through the 6 steps with him. Earl claimed that those, quote, 6 steps were 1, complete deflation, 2, dependence and guidance from a higher power, 3, moral inventory, 4, confession, 5, restitution, and 6, continue to work with alcoholics, end quote. Now, there's several obvious elements of standard Oxford group practices and quite frankly, general spiritual practices to be found in at least 4 of Earl's 6 steps. 2 of the 4 basic spiritual practices of the Oxford group called for surrender, which is Earl's number 2 step, and restitution, which is Earl's number 5 step. And 2 of the 5 C's offered by the Oxford group as their own Christian program of recovery are confession, Earl's step number 4, and continuance, Earl's step number 6. So Earl's story does nothing more than confirm that the early Akron members were deeply embedded in the Oxford group and slavishly following the spiritual program being offered to them there. Besides this strong connection to the Oxford group, rather than any early 6-step program of recovery, the fact of the matter is that Earl's big book story was written 18 years after he supposedly went through the 6-step program. He did not write a story for the first edition of the big book. It didn't appear until the second edition of the big book in 1955. In short, claiming that the Akron 6-step program as it was at that time is identical with the 6-step program that Bill Wilson later talked about is just one more case of modifying the past to fit the present reality. False memory. So, how much credibility can we actually give to this written long after the fact story that Earl's steps, quote-unquote steps, were the same as the 6 steps that Bill Wilson started talking about in 1949? I would have to say none. One side, we have one single story written 18 years after the fact and at least 5 years after Bill Wilson started spreading this 6-step story far and wide in Alcoholics Anonymous. And on the other side, there's a veritable mountain. I mean, a mountain of contemporary evidence that makes absolutely no mention of any 6-step program in early Alcoholics Anonymous. Let's face it, to claim that Earl's story proves they were actually getting sober on Bill Wilson's 6-step program in early AA, you would have to believe that Dr. Bob Smith got sober doing Ebby's 6 steps. Bill said Ebby gave them to him in November 1934, doing Ebby's 6 steps, but somehow just forgot to mention it in his big book story. And Hank Parkhurst also got sober on those 6 steps, but didn't say anything about it in his big book story. And Joe Doppler forgot to talk about being saved by the 6-step program in his big book story. And Florence Rankin also failed to mention those 6 steps in her story, as did Bill Rudell, Harry Brick, Jim Scott, Walter Bray, Clarence Schneider, Ernie Galbraith, and Tom Lucas, along with Bill Van Horn, who got sober using those 6 steps but didn't remember to mention it in his big book story. And neither did Charlie Simonson or Del Tryon or Bob Oviatt or Wally Gillum or Archie Trowbridge or Paul Stanley or Harold Sears. And Norman Hunt got sober. You got to believe that Norman Hunt got sober using those 6 steps, but didn't think it was important enough to mention in his big book story, along with Harry Zeller, who didn't do that, or Ray Furlong, or Dick Stanley, or Myron Williams, or Horace Meyer, or Ray Campbell, or Lloyd Tate. Do you really think it's possible that all of those writers just forgot to mention It was Bill's fairly concise 6-step program they had followed to be relieved of their alcoholism. You really think that's possible? Look, we all have to decide how we're going to weigh the available evidence. We just all have, everybody's got to go do that on their own. But I think Earl's much later single claim is absolutely overwhelmed by the huge amount of negative evidence against it, that there was a 6-step program being practiced in Ohio in 1937. It looks like that, folks. When I put it on a scale, that's what it looks like. So I'm siding with the great AA historian, Ernie Kurtz, who wrote Not God. Ernie noted in that book, the formulation of these 6 steps was contrived by Wilson. And with the highly respected AA historian Glenn Chestnut, who wrote, there is no evidence that there was any formal set of 6 steps being listed and followed by people in AA prior to Bill Wilson's writing of the 12 steps in early December of 1938. No evidence. People who like things neat and tidy, with lists to memorize, tend to get carried away with this idea of 6 steps. And they start imagining early AA meetings with a window shade mounted on the walls displaying the list of the 6 steps, and everybody sitting around memorizing and analyzing the 6 steps. No evidence. Given all of that evidence that no one in early AA ever mentions getting sober by following a 6-step program, I believe we can confidently agree with Ernie Kurtz that the story was something that was contrived by Bill Wilson. Which leaves us with the third major problem in Bill Wilson's version of where the steps came from and how they were written. If Bill didn't get the 12 steps from those fictitious 6 steps, then where did they come from? I believe they came from Bill's own experience of getting sober, rather than from the collective experience of the group. I think he took it and the group was doing a lot of these things that show up in the 12 steps. There's no doubt about it, but Wilson was really focused on the things that he had done. There are 2 fairly substantial reasons for believing this. Well aware of his own tendency towards grandiosity, Wilson repeatedly denied himself credit for things that he was solely responsible for, and he generously gave credit on that to other people. Once again, the perfect example of this is the ever-growing list of co-founders, ever-growing list that Bill created over the years. I mean, Bob Smith is a co-founder, and Ann Smith, his wife, is a co-founder. Dr. Silkworth's a co-founder, and Sister Ignatia is a co-founder, and Sam Shoemaker is a co-founder, and William James is even a co-founder, just to mention 6 of them. Now, all of those people, please believe me, I'm not dismissing those people. All those people did make substantial contributions to Alcoholics Anonymous, but the truth is that Bill Wilson is the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Capital letters, bold, underlined. He's the founder. The other reason he started telling that story was because claiming this is what we did is so much more convincing and persuasive than saying this is what I did. Contemporary primary documents confirm the fact that the 12 steps grew directly out of Bill Wilson's own experience in getting sober, and we have two unimpeachable sources in support of this claim. The first one dates from January 30th, 1948. That's 16 months. This is 16 months before Bill first told that 6-step story in Montreal. Bill and Lois are on a train. They're going to Washington, D.C. for an AA regional banquet. And with them on the train is a lawyer, Paul Hennessy, and a woman, Eileen Barrett. Sounds like she's his secretary, but she might be a junior partner. What do I know? Paul is going to be giving a speech at that banquet. So he's, Paul's an AA guy. He's in the deal here. And the speech he's going to give is going to honor Fitz Mayo, who's the founder of the Washington AA group that they're going down. That's where the party is. And Paul tells Bill, he says that he's never heard the story of the evolution of the 12 steps. Never heard the story. And he asked for some details. Now, just think about that for a second. He's never heard the story, although it's 9 years after the event. People have been getting sober on the 12 steps for 9 years, and Bill's never told the story about where they came from, the evolution of them. Paul thought Bill's story of where the steps came from that he told that day, after he asked him to elaborate, was so important and impressive that it was, quote unquote, this is in a letter that's in the GSO archive, was of sufficient importance to commit to writing. And several months after that January train ride, Paul wrote to Bill saying, as soon as we reached Washington, on that trip last January, I dictated my version of Bill's stories to Eileen Barrett, who agreed with me, who was sitting there with my version as outlined. This memorandum has been compiled from the original draft, which is now before me, the thing I put together right after I got off the train that day, and from a subsequent conversation with Bill Wilson. So he's talked to Bill about what he's written and what Bill had told him. Paul notes that his, quote, noting his subsequent conversation with Bill and his written request in this letter that Bill, he sent Bill 2 copies of this thing, that Bill countersigned one of them and returned it to him for safekeeping. It attests to the fact that Wilson confirmed and endorsed this version of the story of how the 12 steps came to be written. In that quote unquote approved memorandum, Paul says Bill Wilson explained, quote, how the pioneers in AA fought, and prayed their way through to recovery, end quote. And Bill noted that in those days, quote, the alcoholic was obliged, 1, to admit he was powerless over alcohol, 2, to make an inventory of his own character, 3, to put trust in God, and 4, to work with other alcoholics. 4-step program. Quote, according to Bill, as it stood, this program needed clarification. So Bill says he sat down and began to figure out the various phases of his own recovery. Setting them down on paper, Bill says he found that there were 12 separate and distinct steps in his various phases of his own recovery. And that was the story Bill Wilson countersigned and approved as being true in late 1948, 7 months before he first told the 6-step story to those psychiatrists in Montreal. Now, some might object to relying too heavily on this 10 years after the fact piece of evidence that proves that Bill Wilson wrote the 12 steps based solely on his own experience. But we also have some much earlier and much more credible evidence to confirm that story. As we have seen, there is no evidence in the contemporary documents, including those 30 stories written in the first edition of the Big Book, of there being an early 6-step or a 12-step program of recovery from alcoholism. But absolute confirmation that the steps were a summation of the quote-unquote various phases of Bill Wilson's own recovery can be explicitly found in the 2 versions of Bill's story written in late May of 1938. We've already talked about them. They're in Bill's story, and there is a solution were written. And so that's a full 6 months before the 12 steps were supposedly first written. In late May of 1938, Bill Wilson wrote he first wrote a very long and then a much shorter version of his story. And in them, he explicitly mentions 11 of the 12 steps. Only thing missing is the 2nd step, which we're going to hear about in a few minutes, how Hank Parker's shoehorned that in at the last minute. In the first written longer version of his story, it was 12,000 words. Wilson's supposedly shooting for 5,000 words per chapter here, so he was not in control of his material. And that story is often called the original story. Bill Wilson plainly mentions 8 of the 12 steps. And in the shorter version that followed, just 5,300 words, he neatly paraphrases 10 of the 12 steps. So look, again, people say, really? Really? Like that? Here's a comparison of the 12 steps as they were first formally published in April of 1939 with the 12 steps that can be found in these 2 earliest versions of Bill's story. So on the left-hand side, we've got the published version of the 12 steps, April 39. And on the right-hand side, we're going to have excerpts from the original story and from Bill's story from May of 1938. Step 1. Like myself, he admitted defeat. Now, admittedly, this is the least impressive correspondence between what Bill wrote in Bill's story and the first step. But you can hardly say that about the rest of the comparisons we're going to see going on here. They're just so drop dead explicit. It's almost laughable. Step 3, from the original story, turn my face to God as I understand him and place my life at his disposal. From Bill's story, I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. Step 4 from the original story. Take a thorough and ruthless inventory of my moral defects and derelictions. And from Bill's story, I ruthlessly faced my sins of omission and commission, made a list of people towards whom I felt resentment. Step 5. Original story. I should sit down with whatever person I chose and reveal to him without any reservations whatever the results of my self-appraisal, and to be really honest with myself and God. And from Bill's story, I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. Step 6, original story. I'm now willing to rid myself of all these defects. Moreover, I was to understand that this would not be accomplished by myself alone. Therefore, step 7, original story. I was to humbly ask God that he take these handicaps away. And from Bill's story, became willing to have my newfound friend, capital F, take them away root and branch. Step 8, original story. Made a list of all the people I have hurt and with whom I had bad relations. From Bill's story, we made a list of people I had hurt or towards whom I felt resentments. I expressed my entire willingness to approach those individuals, admitting my wrong. Willingness. Step 9, original story. Approach these people telling them I had come to set matters right insofar as I possibly could, but discretion should be used lest others should be hurt. And from Bill's story, I should write all such matters to the utmost of my ability. Step 10, original story. The principle of making amends was to continue into the future. Promptly admit it. Step 11, Bill's story. I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. And step 12, note on the left-hand side, the original printing in the first edition of the Big Book was having had a spiritual experience rather than having a spiritual awakening. They changed it for the second printing, and it's been awakening ever since. But from Bill's story, there are 3 parts, of course, to the 12th step. So here we go. Bill's story. The moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. I felt lifted up as though a great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. Part 2. I soon found that when all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. Part 3. My friend had emphasized the absolute necessity of my demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. In short, although he has always been claimed that the 12 steps were first written in early December, this is absolutely concrete evidence that Bill had clearly written 11 of them out as the various phases of his own recovery and his story a full 6 months before December of 1938. The first time I was in the archive and they handed me this particular, version of Bill's story, I was like, I realized that the steps are right there. It was something I had known reading Bill's story in the book, but all of a sudden I realized the dates didn't correspond at all. I believe that ever the pragmatist, Bill Wilson saw that if he wanted to create something specific, so specific that the suffering alcoholic could not wiggle out of it, that his own experience was the best way to describe the quote-unquote suggested program of recovery they should follow to get sober. And I think it's important to note that those first 2 early versions of Bill's stories made no mention of the second step. I already said that, but between the February printing of the multilith copy and the April publication of the Big Book, Hank Parkhurst, in his own handwriting, added 4 amazing paragraphs to Bill's story, which do in fact cover the second step. So here's the 4 paragraphs. Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence or universal mind or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. My friend, this would be Ebby Thatcher, my friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain on whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. And that brings the total number of steps to be found in Bill's story today up to 12. Thank you, Hank Parkhurst, for those 4 critical paragraphs in Bill Wilson's story. And yeah, here's a picture of my big book, right? Underlined, highlighted, but there's the steps numbered right up. most of them showing up in pages 12 and 13. If you don't believe, just go look in your big book on pages 12 and 13. They're right there, folks. So if it was true, as we have seen, that the 6 steps do not break down into the 12 steps and that there's no contemporary mention of the 6-step program in early AA, and the 12 steps are really just a recounting of Bill Wilson's own experience in getting sober, problem 1, 2, 3, then there's a fourth major problem that needs to be explained, and that's why did Bill Wilson start telling that bogus 6-step story in May of 1949? It's certainly an interesting question, but I haven't been able to find any documentary evidence to help me explain this. I just haven't been able to do that. So in an attempt to answer that question, because I think it's a very important question in terms of this whole consideration of the mythological 6-step story. So in an attempt to answer that question, the best I can do is leave behind the world of solid evidence, concrete, primary documented evidence found in the contemporary documents, and offer my best guess speculations. Speculations, underlined, highlighted, bigger font time. A diligent search of all of Bill's 1940 speeches and grapevine articles finds absolutely no evidence that he ever made a public origin of the 12-step story before May 24th, 1949. Given all of his other 1940 stories and writings and talks about things that happened during AA's earliest years, the fact that he never once talked about the creation of the 12 steps falls somewhere between shocking and surprising. Again, what's more important and central to Alcoholics Anonymous than the 12 steps? And had that story completely ignored for a dozen years, 10 years at least, I would speculate that the reason for that silence can be found in some of the evidence already presented here. The 12 steps weren't the steps that we took, as it says so explicitly in the big book. They were the steps that Bill took. But we is so much more convincing and persuasive. I would also speculate that the reason Bill avoided telling any origin of the 12-step story was because to truthfully do so would reveal that they were primarily based on just one man's experience in getting sober, rather than the collective experience of 100 men and women as claimed in the big book. Given the fact that Bill Wilson admitted to Paul Hennessy in January of 1948 that the steps were based on his own experience, and the fact that Paul Hennessy then put those facts in writing with Bill Wilson's approval in October of 1948, I would further speculate that after this single, unguarded moment of candor on the train, Bill Wilson began to worry that it might become public knowledge that he had admitted his own experience was the real source and basis of the 12 steps. I think Bill started to worry about that. Speculation. And to have that information, if that was true, to have that information spread more widely would raise serious doubts about the 10-year-old foundation story of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the steps were a collective presentation of everyone's experience in getting sober, potentially derailing the ongoing success of Alcoholics Anonymous' program of recovery in 1948, 1949, 1950. We don't want that to happen. And so, to protect AA from the possible disastrous consequences of that story spreading widely, I believe that 7 months later, Bill Wilson rolled out this new AA myth about there being a quote-unquote original and gradually evolving quote-unquote 6-step program. A tall tale of the 6-step program that those early AA supposedly followed before the 12 steps were published in April of 1939, rather than all of those Oxford group practices we noted before, and that he simply broke those existing steps into the more specific and detailed 12 steps on that fateful day in early December of 1938. Bill Wilson certainly wanted to distance AA from an almost complete dependence on those Oxford group practices throughout its formative years, and he wanted to ensure that the 12 steps were recognized as a uniquely AA solution to alcoholism. Think about this. This is our solution. This is our solution. This is our experience. This is worked for us. This is our unique AA solution for alcoholism. This isn't the Oxford group. This is AA. And to do that, to create this uniqueness, to disallow everything being traced back to the Oxford group in bits and pieces, and to do that, he needed to create an absolutely new backstory, one that claimed those more detailed 12 steps were simply grown out of an already pre-existing 6-step program. Rather than having grown solely out of the Oxford group practices and the other common spiritual practices. I mean, people talk about the Oxford group stuff, but it was was like they invented it and it never existed before the 1920s or 1930s, which is absolutely crazy. It was one particular packaging of a bunch of spiritual things that had been around for centuries, as was the 12 steps. In short, the six-step story firmly established AA as a standalone, original, and wildly successful solution to alcoholism, something Bill Wilson was definitely interested in doing. Note well that these last few sides are pure speculation. Please. Although that's speculation, I got to tell you, it does in fact fit very neatly with all of the other data that we do know to be for sure to be true. Let me be perfectly clear. So you'd be amazed at some of the things people tell me I say. Let me be perfectly clear. Saying that Bill Wilson invented the six-step story in May of 1949, a full 10.5 years after he wrote the 12 steps, is not meant to criticize or denigrate Bill Wilson in any way whatsoever. We need to accept and embrace the fact that Bill wasn't even trying to be an accurate historian. Instead, he was a great storyteller whose stories had just one purpose: to help people get sober. That was the purpose of Bill's stories. And those stories of his, call them parables, call them myths, call them metaphors, call them yarns. Bill actually called it a yarn in his famous Fort Worth speech in '54, or tall tales, or whatever you want to call those stories of Bill Wilson's. They have been tremendously successful in doing exactly that. It's going to be seen by the gratitude felt by over 2 million alcoholics living sober in the world today, not to mention all the other millions of people that have gotten sober and died since 1939. People who got sober on Bill Wilson's life-saving 12 steps. Bill was a man of vision. He wasn't a historian, he was a man of vision. A grand, uplifting, universal, deeply spiritual, and life-saving vision. He was a man who told stories that were meant to sell his vision of recovery to the still suffering alcoholic. So you can hardly fault him if the historical records is found that those thousands of primary documents preserved in the archives across North contradict him as often as it does. So to claim that Bill Wilson invented the six-step story, rather than admit that the 12 steps basically reflected his own experience in getting sober, is very much to Bill Wilson's credit. It's a story about successfully spreading the message of recovery to people who can't stop drinking. By doing so, he effectively, telling that six-step story, effectively took the spotlight off himself. This wasn't a program based on just one man's success, but rather on the successes of a whole group of people, while simultaneously telling that six-step makes the claims of how it works just that much more credible. This is what we did. And he created a detailed and concrete program of recovery that those sneaky alcoholics just could not wiggle out of. And hence we get Bill Wilson telling the mythical origin stories of both the 6 steps and the 12 steps, and thereby saving millions of lives worldwide. Thank you, Bill Wilson. And thank you all for listening.